Greetings to everybody. Thank you very much, Professor Hart, for that kind introduction. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. I want to thank in particular Professor Grudnia for the invitation. I am confident that I'm talking to a group of economists who are much more reasonable. And I know that already from what I just heard from the preceding session. And I think one of the reasons that many economists in the United States have been part of the problem rather than the solution is because they lose themselves in some abstract world of the ivory tower and lose sight of the actual reality of businesses and workers and the economy as it really operates. And I feel already that the economics profession here is much more grounded in the reality of actual business and economic life. And I think that's a very important first step to having a better sense of how economic policy can contribute to a better world. So I feel at home. What I'm going to be talking about are some of the key themes from my new book. It's actually it's out less than a month, so it's really very, very fresh. And I'm trying to think through about how we can apply economic science to a very different kind of a world with very different challenges that you're all quite aware of. I'm addressing three critical economic challenges in particular. We've already heard a lot about the geopolitical issues and that are very much the background to all of this. As an economist, I'm not going to have much to say about that. I just want to emphasize that all of this is going to operate against a very uncertain geopolitical figure. But from the standpoint of economics and where we can contribute the most, I think there are three critical challenges that we must address that's highlighted in this slide. One, of course, and probably the one that needs the least amount to be said is really the climate transition challenge. That's a threat to our physical existence. Second, the erosion of the middle class and the economic anxieties that underpin a lot of our societies these days. And I do think that the economic anxieties and the weakness of the middle class that is probably the most severe in the United States, but I think also runs across most societies in Europe as well, really underpins some of our social problems, and in particular problems of political polarization, the rise of authoritarian populism. While there is a significant cultural dimension to that, it is the case that populations and regions and people and workers that feel economically insecure, that don't feel they have a path and that their children don't have a path towards a secure middle-class existence, are also much more open to be manipulated and to be hostile towards outsiders, whether they view them as ethnic or religious minorities or immigrants, and therefore much more exploitable, so to speak, by right-wing authoritarian demagogues and politicians. So I view the problem of rebuilding the middle class as the central challenge to our social and political life, somewhat analogous to how the climate challenge is a threat to our physical existence. Finally, global poverty reduction and the challenge of economic development, as I think our countries think about how to solve our problems and the climate problem, we should not forget about the global poor and how we can foster an environment that is conducive to economic development is very important. This is an area, of course, thanks to the rise of China and other Asian countries that have done extremely well in the period since the 1990s. We've actually had a lot of gains in the last few decades, but those seem to be under threat today, both by the geopolitical developments, what's happening in world markets, but also, as I'll suggest, because of changes in technological conditions and the fact that traditional models of economic growth and development aren't really working very well. Now, these seem three very different challenges that require very different types of expertise to address, but there is something common that links them thematically and conceptually, and that is that all three of these tasks require fundamental structural change, structural transformation in our economies. They're essentially problems of fostering the right kind of structural transformation. And structural transformation, as we economists know and practical men and women experience in their lives, is something that markets on their own are not very good at accomplishing. Markets and the price system is great at providing the right kinds of incentives in the vicinity of where we are. They're not particularly good about giving us the right price signals and incentives about where we want to be 10, 15, 20 years from now. And therefore, these are areas that are rife with what we as economists would call market failures, and therefore are in need of corrective policies. And the type of corrective policies are essentially would be a kind of industrial policy, because when we think about industrial policy, although I'll use that in a very broad sense, that doesn't necessarily focus on manufacturing industries per se, the task of industrial policy is to foster more rapid structural change in the direction of economic activities, technologies, industries, sectors that further the social purpose. But, and this is a key point, and this is part of why these policies have to be an updated version of what we traditionally have thought of as being industrial policies. First, critical difference is that these are actually directed at very different types of economic activities than what we have traditionally thought of when we think of industrial policy, which is high-tech sectors, sort of export-oriented manufacturing sectors, national champions, and so forth. Here the priorities are very much, I will argue, sectors that are green, renewables, green industries, as well as, I think, a very important challenge of developing productivity in services where, in fact, the bulk of the jobs are going to be. So the new aspects here with respect to when we think about rebuilding the middle class, it's really about fostering of good jobs, which are the sort of the best mechanism of strengthening the middle class. It's not through transfers, it's not through redistribution, although the social welfare state does play an important role. But to foster economic security and create cohesive paths to middle class, we need to create good, productive jobs. And that's more and more is going to require focusing on services, and I'll come back to it in a second, because manufacturing actually is not going to play a very strong, important role going forward. So on the middle class side, I think good jobs and services is going to be critical. On the climate change, and I'll suggest in a second that we've actually quite surprisingly made significant gains on this front, but the gains have come from a very different avenue rather than through economists or technocrats' preferred mechanism of pricing carbon or cap and trade schemes or global cooperation. We've instead had these gains come in the form of green industrial policies, using the carrot of incentives and promoting investments and new technologies rather than the sticks of the taxes or carbon emission reductions. And that's largely been an effort led and produced by China. I'll come to that in a second. And with respect to development, I think we need to put less emphasis on the tried and tested model of export-oriented industrialization, which has worked very well in the past, but because of changing modes of technology and also very different role of the global economy, that increasingly, I think, export-oriented industrialization has lost its power because of the ability of export-oriented manufacturing industries to absorb many workers in low-income settings. So just as in the advanced countries, services become critical for the middle class, creating productive jobs and services becomes actually the main axis of productive structural transformation for growth in developing countries as well. In the book, I emphasize that there are sort of, when we approach these challenges, there are some habits of mind that are useful. I argue that we need to think about our policies explicitly in a second-best setting, where we take into account that there are multiple distortions and always political constraints. As Avinash Dixit once said, the world is second-best at best, and therefore first-best thinking is often not the right way, and sort of we've seen this in a number of these domains. The need for thinking in terms of experimentation and pragmatic policies rather than fixed or blueprints or best practices, because I think a lot of these challenges are calling for new remedies. And to look for national and local solutions over international or remedies that are based on global cooperation, sort of incorporating or internalizing the reality that in fact global cooperation is going to be an insignificantly short solution. Now, all of these are sort of abstract and general things, and the question is whether anything I've said so far has any prospect of being practicable and leading to policies that might work. So let me start actually with something very practical and pragmatic, where we've seen incredible success from a very unexpected source on probably, what we might have thought was the most intractable of these three challenges, namely the climate change. And this is the incredible progress we've made with respect to renewables. And the decline, I think everybody here is familiar with how rapidly the cost of renewable energy has fallen, mainly solar, but also wind, electric batteries, to the point where now, if you're building sort of new sources of power, that renewables are actually cheaper than fossil fuels, and this is creating a fundamentally transformation about the way that the world works, to the point where even some of the most pessimistic and worst critics of climate change, somebody like Bill McKibben in the United States, who was one of the early voices sounding alarm bells about climate change and how far we were from actually meeting that challenge, now has turned almost optimistic and now says that for the first time, really, we can see that thanks to the cost of, how cheap solar power has become, that we could actually envisage a world that remains habitable. Of course, it probably will still cross the 1.5 degrees Celsius warming threshold, but maybe disaster will be averted after all. And where does that renewable success story come from? It comes from essentially what China has achieved. If you look at the installed capacity in solar power, as in the second panel here, it's essentially a story of Chinese investment in solar power. And this green technological miracle in China has been, to be very blunt about it, just the product of Chinese industrial policy combined with the technological fact of learning by doing. So China was not the first country to get into the act here. Europe and in the United States were in fact the early innovators in solar and green and renewables. But starting some 10, 15 years ago, China took the lead, and through the magic of industrial policy and the learning curve, has set into motion a kind of a virtuous cycle of supporting renewables, leading to capacity increase, leading to very sharp reductions in costs, and then prices, market expansion, and then driving more investment and market expansion in turn. Now, it's important to understand the nature of these Chinese industrial policies, because I think the typical Western depiction of these industrial policies portrays them purely as sort of top-down subsidies, and something that's very peculiarly Chinese. But when one looks a little bit closer, one finds that, in fact, this was a much more pragmatic, much more decentralized, and much more multifaceted approach with many, many different instruments, with explicit experimentation and pragmatism, very close collaboration between the central government and local governments on the one hand, as well as business, and with many feedback loops of iteration and revision, such that these local experiments were done, revised, and reformulated. And the policies went significantly beyond credit. Public venture capital played a huge role, as well as local regulatory experimentation and local municipal government procurement rules and so forth. And this was all embedded in a kind of a very explicitly stated, and this is where the central government, in fact, did play a very big role, very explicitly articulated national project. Through this national project, the Chinese government effectively produced a huge global public good, because decline in the price of renewables is a global public good, since the climate challenge is a global challenge to our global commons, but in a way that essentially also privatized some of the benefits of providing this global public good through the competitiveness benefit that Chinese solar manufacturers and other exporters were getting through these technological benefits. Now, it is, of course, the case that industrial policies do not always work. And then the question is this something peculiarly Chinese that maybe other countries cannot emulate? There's one famous example in the United States, the failure of a startup called Solyndra, which was among the first few startups that the Obama administration had promoted when the US, before China, became a major actor in this, when the United States had started promoting solar and other renewable industries. And that story really tells us, sort of a lot about, what, needs to be avoided. The main problem in the case of Solyndra, which became a big political scandal and has effectively killed the U.S. green industrial policies for a whole decade, until really, Biden came to power before the current Trump administration, is that rather than treating these policies, which largely took the form of loans and loan guarantees by the U.S. Department of Energy, rather than treating them as a portfolio of experiments of investing in a lot of different startups, where some of them would effectively be successful, others would necessarily fail, the Obama administration made the crucial mistake of planting its flag on Solyndra as a key example of sort of its initiative, that the Solyndra came to be associated with the program from the get-go. But of course, it turned out that Solyndra had bet on the wrong technology, and then when it failed eventually, as any one of these startups were likely to do, then the whole program was tarred by its failure. Very few people noticed at the time that another beneficiary of loan guarantees around the same time was Tesla, Tesla, of course, was a very little known company at the time, and of course has become a behemoth still. But of course, the social benefits that Tesla provided could have paid many times over for the direct cost of Solindra's failure. But because the US federal government failed to market this program appropriately as a portfolio, and also politically, it favored just one of these firms specifically, it ended up looking like the whole program had been a failure. So there are some lessons, important lessons from this for the conduct of industrial policy, whether it's in the area of green and renewables or elsewhere, that one should not look at industrial policy as an act of picking winners, because nobody can pick winners. The private sector cannot pick winners, and the government cannot pick winners either. It's more a question of whether there is enough flexibility and discipline in these programs that you recognize losers, and then you let the losers go rather than sticking with them long after it's become clear that they're not going to be working out. And that was one big failure of the Obama administration. Second big failure is to think about this as a pragmatic act of experimentation, where there will necessarily be failures, rather than assuming that all of them is going to pay out. And then finally, with respect to comparisons between the West and China, it's important to understand that the reasons for China's success and the relative failure of the few cases that became politicized in the United States really doesn't have anything to do with the fact that the US is democracy and China is an authoritarian regime, because when we look closely at the way that China managed its industrial policy, it wasn't really top-down command and control, hard conditionality. It was much more the government acting as what one analyst called a collaborative catalyst, rather than top-down central planner. And it's something that democracies in principle could also do extremely very well. So I'm using the example of green industrial policies both directly as a substantively important example of how the type of structural transformation policies that is based on close collaboration between the state on the one hand and different business interests and investors on the other can spearhead a process of structural transformation affecting one of these three challenges, the climate challenge in particular. But that still leaves the question as to what about the other two challenges, the middle class and economic development around the world. And as I've already said, I think these two challenges are going to require good and productive jobs to sustain ultimately both democracy and also to promote economic growth. And the question here, is there an analog? Is there a version of these green industrial policies that I've briefly described that also applied to how we can engineer productive transformation to create good jobs as well? Before I talk about that specifically, I want to spend a minute talking about the importance of jobs and good jobs in particular, because I think one of the blind spots of the economics profession, going all the way back really to Adam Smith, has been to downplay the importance of jobs, because in sort of the conventional way that economists, or at least sort of neoclassical economics thinks about jobs, is that actually they're just, they benefit us only really indirectly, because jobs are only a way of increasing our incomes and relaxing our budget constraints. In fact, jobs enter the utility function negatively to the extent that we put leisure in the utility function rather than employment per se. But of course, in reality, jobs hold a very different position in our own sort of social existence and our own a sense of well-being. Jobs are a source of personal esteem, social recognition, dignity, gives us a sense of who we are, how we contribute to society. And what a long list of research, empirical research on what constitutes what determines happiness or life satisfaction, finds that along with family, jobs are the most important determinant of well-being, personal well-being, and that the utility loss that's associated, for example, with the loss of jobs is several times the direct income loss. So the usual economist way of thinking about how you treat job loss, which is maybe we compensate people for the loss of jobs. That simply doesn't work, because when people lose jobs or regions lose employment, the personal costs are much greater than just the losses in income. And that also relates to what I think, the second big category of reasons that jobs matter beyond the personal costs, is that job loss is also a fundamental source of negative social externalities. That job losses in different regions, are whether it's due to trade, whether it's due to automation or it's due to fiscal austerity, produces economic, social, and policy externalities in political externalities in the form of higher crime rates, broken families, increased mortality, greater addiction rates, and ultimately support for authoritarian populism. Going back to something that I've said earlier, that links economic anxiety, in particular anxieties over jobs, to support for authoritarian populism. And then therefore, also from the perspective of social justice, I think this gives us a kind of an alternative perspective on social justice, which is, instead of focusing purely on distributive justice, which is the question about who gets what, and that can be handled perhaps through redistribution, through an expansive safety nets, but the parallel notion is actually contributive justice, to use the term that my Harvard colleague Michael Sandel has used. And contributive justice refers to the notion that we want also, each one of us deserve and want the opportunity to win the social recognition and esteem that go with producing what others need and value. And that is much more to do with the jobs we perform, instead of not just the incomes. So having said that, as to why I think jobs are extremely important and where typically economists have underplayed it, and therefore finding the consequences of the globalization shocks and the regional decline in employment that many parts of the United States and Europe have faced, and the political consequences, I think it's important to bring that up front. So where are these jobs going to be? Where are we, if we're going to create these good jobs, where are they going to be? I think we need to face up to the important fact that going forward, these jobs are not going to be in manufacturing. Now, manufacturing is going to remain important for a variety of reasons, for national security, for innovation, for the green transition. But when it comes to jobs, manufacturing is going to play an increasingly small role. In the United States now, fewer than 1 in 12 jobs are in manufacturing. So when both the right and the left, their programs for restoring the middle class focuses on reshoring manufacturing or reigniting manufacturing, there's a reason that it doesn't produce the political effect that it's supposed to do, because sort of the representative worker in the United States or in much of Western Europe is no longer really in manufacturing. Now, to some extent, I think that's also going to be the case for Poland. Poland, of course, has been relatively well-positioned through its links through supply chains in Western Europe and Germany to support a relatively high level of manufacturing and manufacturing employment, and the decline in manufacturing employment is not as obvious in the statistics that I've seen for Poland, but still we're talking about less than 1 in 5 workers, and I don't see this going up given the nature of technological change. And let me explain why I don't think this is going to go up, no matter how much reshoring that is done, how much sort of manufacturing Europe is able to claw back from China. So even if that was possible through trade and other industrial policies, the fact is that while China has been able to increase its manufacturing footprint on world markets, export ever larger quantities of manufacturing and become a bigger and bigger part of the overall global marketplace in manufacturing, in fact, employment in Chinese manufacturing has plummeted. Over the last 10, 15 years, China has lost more workers in manufacturing than the total amount of manufacturing workers that exist in the United States and Germany combined. So, and why is that? That's because, it's automation. It's the changing nature of technology. And that's true of all of the most successful manufacturing exporters that you may want to emulate, even if you're able to maintain or increase your manufacturing output or manufacturing value added, it's not going to have an impact on employment per se. So where will the jobs be? Jobs will be in services. And in particular types of services especially, and these are mostly non-traded services, mostly kinds of services that we don't think of when we think about industrial policy, but becomes increasingly more important going forward. In the United States, these are, because of the demographic transition, they are particularly services in home health and personal care, fast food and counter workers, retail salespeople, stockers and order fillers, cashiers, customer service representatives. This is where the jobs are, whether we like it or not, and this is where the jobs are going to be. Now, most of these jobs, in fact, I think 8 out of the top 10 occupations in the next 10 years in the United States actually don't require formal training. So that's a kind of a disappointing thing to say for a university professor, that basically more university training, more access to college education is not going to be the solution to producing good jobs in these sectors, because these sectors are not sectors that actually require a college education. So it's going to be critical to find ways of increasing directly productivity in these highly labor-absorbing service sectors. And traditionally, these sectors have been very slow in increasing productivity. But here, I want to suggest that there are some possibilities that I think become more and more important potentially with more innovation policies and industrial policies that are directly targeting productivity in services. In recent years, if we look at productivity statistics in some key services, in fact, productivity has increased as rapidly, if not more rapidly, in services than in manufacturing. That is true in the United States since 2005, in the last 2 decades, over in wholesale trade, in retail trade, in accommodation and food services. So, in a way, I mean, think about Amazon or Uber, the kind of the new technologies that they managed to bring in have essentially transformed and significantly increased productivity. So that points to the productivity possibilities, but of course, it also points to the need for us to rethink organizationally how technologies are actually deployed, because the way that these technologies have been deployed in companies like Amazon and Uber don't necessarily create good jobs, because there are technologies that are based on monitoring, on essentially on extracting the most of the surplus that's possible from the drivers in Uber and so forth. But these same technologies can also be deployed in ways that are going to be much more directly beneficial to workers, and I'll come back to that in a second. So I think there's a tight connection between the need to create good jobs, and the use of industrial policy for that purpose that goes simply beyond education. It's actually working directly with firms, innovations, startups to increase productivity and increase demand for good firms and good jobs. So the strategy here, the industrial policy strategy here, although not for manufacturing, but for services, would be a strategy to increase demand for less educated, lower skilled workers by increasing the productivity of such workers and the firms that employ them. And a lot of this is going to be both by providing the needed public inputs, but also the kinds of technologies that actually empower low-skilled workers, whether they're in retail or in care. So what is that going to look like in practice? And in my book, I talk about sort of examples on which one could build. One is a variety of subnational and local development coalitions or programs where, somewhat similar to how China or Chinese municipalities have experimented around green industrial policies through a variety of policies. We have a variety of local experiments in the United States, of local jurisdictions, where either local economic development agencies, local nonprofits, local business groups, or other civic leaders essentially launch programs that are collaborative, bringing different stakeholders together, that combine, on the one hand, specific workforce vocational training with business development and business attraction. These are sort of models of these examples of much more modern style of industrial policy, where the focus is much less on subsidies, but much more on identifying a vision and constraints that are where the interventions on the part of local agencies or state or government agencies could be subsidies, but they are predominantly also what one might call customized public inputs in the form of coordination, in the form of workforce and management training, providing specific business or extension services, providing technology, greenfields, regulatory assistance, and so forth. And then finally, I think, linking back to my comments about the potential for technology, but also to ensure that the new technologies are developed in a much more labor-friendly direction, that there are specific examples in care, in retail, education, how the use of new technologies, now increasingly AI, can empower less experienced, less highly educated workers to provide much more sophisticated care, much more sophisticated customer service, customized to the needs of the patients or the customers, and provide a much wider range of tasks at the same time. And the advantage of this is that this basically is how productivity on the job is increased. And so in these highly labor-intensive areas where the human touch will remain extremely important, if we can deploy and develop these technologies in ways that are going to directly increase productivity of the workers in those sectors, we can transform jobs in those sectors that have been traditionally bad jobs with very low pay into much better jobs and much more solid foundation for a middle class. That, however, will require a much more self-conscious, directed innovation by the states, that pushing innovation directly in that kind of a direction. So we have a DARPA or most countries have innovation programs that focus on defense-related technologies. We have, as we've seen in China and other investment or innovation programs for renewables, we have investment innovation programs that are directed towards green and renewables and new technologies to advance on the green transition. I think we need a public and directed public and self-conscious effort also to invest in technologies that are explicitly worker-friendly. And here's sort of why I sort of said we need an ARPA-W, an ARPA for workers. So this, as I've already indicated, the types of industrial policy I'm talking about here are very different from traditional top-down industrial policies that are based on picking winners, the use of subsidies, and ideally hard conditionality. In fact, the kind of industrial policy that I'm talking about, that I've exemplified with my specific illustrations, are much more flexible, that are much more collaborative, that are based on provision of public input, a variety of public inputs rather than just subsidies, and where conditionality tends to be much more soft, provisional, open-ended, and the relationship with recipients are collaborative and iterative with active project management rather than arm's length. So one implication of sort of looking at economic policy from the perspective of good jobs and the middle class is that it also brings our the traditionally divergent perspective of social policy and growth policy together. So when we traditionally think about social policy, it's about redistribution, it's about safety nets, it's about social welfare. When we think about growth policy, it's really about focusing on the tradable sectors, on large firms, on multinationals, direct foreign investment, international trade. But if increasingly the health of our societies are going to require on creating solid and strong pathways to the middle class, to the creation of good jobs, really we're really combining both objectives. That's the best growth policy is actually to strengthen the middle class, and the best social policy is actually also to do the same. So coming back to my challenges, I think one of the implications and under the circumstances of the current world economy, which, as I've called it in my book, a fractured world economy, one of the silver linings of this kind of an approach is that it actually puts less emphasis on the need for global cooperation. Strengthening middle class doesn't require trade protection or competition in manufacturing, which could be a zero sum for the world as a whole. It focuses much more on non-tradable services, and therefore countries can do it on their own without necessarily providing adverse spillovers. Climate change. Global cooperation remains important, but if we can take the Chinese green industrial policies as our model, we can make a lot of progress there by countries essentially linking their commercial and economic and productivity agendas with the transition, the green transition agenda in a way that serves both their economic ends, but also provides a global public good. With respect to development, if what I've argued is correct, the success of developing countries, again, is also going to depend much less on the health of the global economy and therefore global cooperation than in what they do domestically. So let me just conclude here. I've covered a lot of different topics. I hope I've said enough. That you get a bit of an idea about what the book is about, but that you'll still want to read the book because there's more in it. But it essentially that these three critical challenges are linked together with the need to accomplish structural transformation, and that structural transformation requires local initiatives that often are much less dependent on the nature of the global economy or the state of global cooperation than the ability of local stakeholders and civic leaders and government agencies to get together and to develop these national and subnational projects. So in that sense, it's a kind of a much more optimistic take on where we might be going, and I hope that optimism might prevail over the very dark clouds of geopolitics and the global economy with which we are typically preoccupied. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for a very insightful and inspiring lecture. We have a couple of minutes still, so I would like you to ask some questions, maybe, some questions, comments regarding Professor Dani Rodrik's. Yes, please, and please.
Yeah, hi. Is it working? Oh,
yes,
it's working. Okay, so I understand I haven't read your book. As you said, it's like 1 month ago, so maybe you explain a little more in the book, but I had a problem with many things, like I will not, deal with everything, but you indicate at the beginning that you have like 3 connected problems. Climate, jobs, like trying to restore middle class, and global poverty. In reality, you focus mostly on jobs and restoring middle class, almost nothing about poverty. And okay, what point I try to make? Like, I'm not sure what is the connection between all of them, because I think in some sense, the story about climate change, I think you argued that everything is good, in some sense, that we are moving in a good direction. And I'm not sure if this is the case, or maybe you are too optimistic. I'm not an expert in that, but you made the argument that we use more, less coal and stuff like that, and more green energy. But I don't know how it's called, but you have like paradox, but that because of that we use more clean energy, we use more energy overall. And maybe this is like a problem. So I'm curious if you think that this story is so positive. The last comment, I have much more, but about jobs. You argue that we need to restore a middle class. So I understand your diagnosis of the populist right is connected with globalization, the problem that people lose their jobs. So the argument that Trump gets elected twice because of that, losing jobs in the United States. And you argue that we need to restore middle class. But the problem with this argument for me is that if you have middle class, it means that you have people who are higher and lower. So I'm not sure if you can make everyone middle class. When I'm going with this argument is that you didn't address, at least in this talk, about rising inequalities. So I'm curious if you see the problem that it's not only about having a good job, but people compare themselves with other people. So you can have a good job or you can have a job, but still, due to the increasing inequality, you can still be angry. So 2 points, 2 questions for you, like climate, do you think that everything is going fine? Or maybe this is more problematic story. And about middle class, do you think that this is only about giving people jobs? Or maybe inequality, because this is inherent with the capitalism, etc., etc. I think you get my point. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So let me just focus on those 2 things that you said. On climate, it is true that I came across as very optimistic. The point here is to point to where we are now compared to where we thought we were going to be 10, 15 years ago. None of the experts expected 10, 15 years ago to be where we are today in terms of the success that we've had on renewables. And so that's number one. So I'm glad you said that we want to sort of not be over-optimistic about this, but there are reasons to be much more optimistic about where we are compared to where we thought we were going to be. And to the point, that was my reference to Bill McKibben, to the point where a lot of people, some of you also may have heard of, Bill Gates recently came out with a statement that suggests that because of the many of the same trends that I've talked about, that fighting climate change may not be necessarily the biggest priority right now, or the single best lens from which to address issues of global poverty, given how much progress we now have achieved in terms of bringing the cost of renewables down. Now, of course, we're increasing to use energy, but I mean, that's okay, as long as we're making significantly quicker transition to renewables. So we haven't turned the corner by any means, but we're in a much better position than anybody thought we're going to be 10, 15 years. And secondly, I think the important thing to understand from terms of strategy forward, we are in a much better position, not because the strategies that we have pursued through global cooperation and the Kyoto and Paris and annual COPs, global cooperation has produced better results than we thought they were going to do. No, we've had better result because of action purely at the national level. And I think that's an important, because it says that the binding constraint really is not, even in this domain where climate change is the prototypical area of global public good, that the action has come not through global cooperation, but through individual country action, which I think I take as a very important positive thing, because if we were to rely only on global cooperation, I think we would need to be very pessimistic. Now, I think I'm also glad you raised the issue of the middle class versus inequality. So I do not, there might be many reasons you care about inequality, but I think what I take from the empirical literature on the relationship between the rise of authoritarian populism and economic dislocation, that this is not about inequality per se. And therefore, that it is much more about job loss and about insecurities with regard to the middle class. And growing the middle class, by the way, is not a zero-sum matter, because you can look in the United States, for example, the share of people who are sort of in the median income brackets has steadily shrunk. So you can have a reduction in the size of the middle class. It's also a kind of a state of mind, whether people think that they are or will belong, or their children have a path to middle class. But I guess my perspective is different, and I think it is useful to emphasize that, and your question brings out. My perspective is different from two alternative perspectives that are driven from concern from inequality. The one that would say that the only problem, or the main problem, is inequality, so therefore we need to bring the bottom up. So let's focus on anti-poverty. Let's provide income support to the very poor. That might be good for a lot of reasons, but I don't think it's going to be the answer to providing cohesive societies and fundamental foundations for democracy. The second alternative is inequality is a huge problem. Let's tax wealth and let's cut down corporations to size. A big debate, of course, in the U.S., in Europe about wealth taxes and so forth. Again, that might be desirable for a variety of reasons, but I don't think it's going to be the answer to that particular problem. That's why I emphasize the role of productivity-based strategy on the middle class.
So let's take one more question, please.
Hi, Rebecca Sandin-Piątkowska. I am the head of strategic communication and development at TVP World Services. That's Polish television's English news, global news. Thank you very much. My question is simple. How would you relate the structure of your new book to Poland's economic success and then your recipe for the future? So really quickly, the speakers before you came up were talking about Poland's Złoty wiek, the golden age of Poland and Poland's economic miracle. How does your structure explain some of that great success story? And what would be your advice for continuing on Poland's future economic success? Thank you so much.
You're putting me on the spot, and I always hesitate to appear like I know more on a topic that obviously I'm in the midst of the experts. But I would say that Poland has had extraordinary success. The first time I came in Poland was in January 1990, and that was when the shops were still empty, and Poland was just on the verge of experiencing a major increase in unemployment and economic deprivation. That would last for a bit in the course of the early stage of the transition. But then the growth that Poland experienced was really amazing and exemplary. And I think there was something very special in Poland's experience that it was, as I see it was the combination of two things. One is the ability to generate very rapid economic catch-up in a process where being just on the edge of Western Europe and as a sort of incoming member of the EU, the economy could take very substantial advantage of integrating itself into the supply chains in Western Europe. So the possibilities of manufacturing transformation, industrial upgrading, and taking advantage of trade, those possibilities were very high. Now, there were other countries in the world during the same period that had the same advantages. I often, for example, compare it to Mexico. Mexico also was geographically in a position somewhat similar to that of Poland. Poland was right next door to Germany. Mexico is right next door to the United States, and because of NAFTA, Mexico had the advantage of being able to integrate itself into North American supply chains. But unlike Poland, Mexico did not experience anything like the economic growth. In fact, total factor productivity growth over the period since NAFTA in Mexico has been negative. Total factor productivity growth has been negative. Now, of course, segments of the Mexican economy in the north have done very well, but the Mexican economy as a whole has done very poorly. So what does that tell us? It tells us that the industrial, sort of trade and integration into European supply chains wasn't the whole thing. There was also significant, institutional transformation that was enabled by first the prospect of admission into the EU, and then, subsequently, being EU members. So that institutional transformation, the rule of law, the democracy, the new norms, I think the new understanding about regulations, those were, critical, and very few countries have the luxury of being able to undergo such a momentous institutional transformation in such a short time. And the possibilities of EU membership, I think, provided that. So I think that's sort of backward looking. That would be my interpretation of those, importance of those two factors. Now, I think going forward, it's going to be very different. I think unless I misunderstood, I think some of the previous speakers mentioned that it's no longer a process of catch-up. So it's not catch-up. Life at the generally sort of frontier is a little bit tougher. So economic growth is going to be lower. Trade is going to play a much less role. Manufacturing, for reasons I've explained, is going to play a much less important role. Germany is in a big trouble, and sort of it's not going to be the engine. So I think it's going to be a more difficult period for Poland, and I would return back to sort of one of the key messages in the book is let's look more to our economic performance. Measure it more from the lens of, are we creating good, productive jobs for the middle class? Are we creating economic security? Rather than from the perspective of overall economic growth or volumes of trade, volumes of foreign investment. So it's a kind of a different lens. But in terms of providing for social cohesion and the foundations for political democracy, I think paying attention to these issues of economic insecurity, economic anxiety, and of the middle class, which necessarily means paying a lot more attention about how we can make services much more productive, as I've argued, is a very different sort of perspective on these issues. So I think we need to switch in Poland as well as in other countries a bit more to that perspective.
So thank you, Professor. Thank you again. Thank you for coming. And please enjoy coffee break. Thank you.